Today on the Rise of the Challenge podcast.
Are difficult things to sort of claw into when you've lost that trust, and that's a difficult road. So there was definitely a lot of that for me, and in addition to I started to develop friendships with people who were sober, and had been in recovery or were just starting in recovery, that sort of thing. So that was also helpful too.
Welcome to the Rise of the Challenge podcast. Joined today, he's an author and entrepreneur. It's Daryl Dittmer. How are you doing today, Daryl?
I am great, Alex. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on.
We're so excited to have you on the show to talk about your rise to the challenge. What we like to do with all of our guests is go right to the beginning. Talk about where you're from and what you like doing growing up.
Well, I am from the Midwest, and I grew up in Michigan, and grew up in a very blue collar family. So it was a pretty strict household. My dad was a mechanic. My mom took care of us kids. I think my mom had the tougher job. I have an older brother and a younger sister, and my dad, he worked a ton, a lot of overtime, that sort of thing, to keep the household going. And so I grew up with, some discipline. My dad was a Navy vet, grew up with, a fairly strict upbringing. And one of the things that I was taught early on was work ethic. We were taught to, fend for ourselves to a large extent, as much as we could, kind of growing up. And then, I remember what my dad, he put me in front of a farmer when I was 14, and he said, "Can you put him to work?" And the farmer said, "Yeah." And then, within a year, I was working on this farm with, just cow poo on my boots and just, everywhere, actually on my tennis shoes, and I had holes in them, and it would leak through, and I'd go through the barnyard. And one day I said to my dad, I said, "Hey, can I get some new boots?" He said, "Yeah, you're working. You can start buying your own stuff." So, that was a great way. It was a great message for me, in terms of being a young person, and, hey, I got to fend for myself. So that was the beginning of me, getting into the teenage years. And then when I entered the teenage years, I got into drugs and alcohol, and a lot of people do that, but I took things to the extreme, and it went, I went pretty far, pretty fast. And by the time I was 18, I was asked to speak with a counselor, and I actually ended up doing that, and I got put into a drug treatment program just after I turned 19. So interesting beginning to my life, but that's where all the fun started.
Where do you feel was the biggest transition from going from that working on the farm, and then that transition to getting into that drugs and alcohol and all of that?
I think it was a lot of, I had a lot of insecurity. I think I had, some expectations on me that maybe I didn't feel like I was living up to. I got really, I couldn't look people in the eye. I got very sort of closed off. It was interesting because I don't feel like I didn't grow up in an alcoholic household. I didn't grow up with a mom and dad who were drinking every day or doing drugs or anything like that. But there's it doesn't have to be that. So it can be expectations. It can be, the insecurity stuff. It can be a lot of things that, maybe we get from parents or whatever. Some things are handed down that we can never really name. So I think for me, I put a big burden on myself to perform, and I still do, but I don't think I could handle it when I was younger, and for the last many, many years, now I can handle it.
Did your family members notice changes when you were going through drugs and alcohol? Did you ever tell them about the insecurities, the burden that you're going through? And did they kind of have an idea of the changes that you were making in your life?
No, they didn't. That sort of addiction, slippery slope doesn't really lend itself to openness. It lends itself more to closed, sort of closed emotionally and that sort of thing. So that's what I did. I really closed up. So I tried to hide because I wasn't raised to be the kid that I became. I was raised, like I said, in a very strict household, but, manners and respect and, all the things that, from a sort of a principled perspective were taught. So more and more shame showed up for me, and trying to hide and not being that person who was letting everybody down. So there was a big gulf that was created between, certainly my mom and dad, but, and me. And that just continued to grow over time until I was more or less hit with an intervention, where I needed to take a look at what I was doing.
Let me pause real quick. Okay. You talked about how the older you got in your teenage years, you ended up going to a treatment facility. But going prior to that, what was that dream job or that dream goal that you were hoping to achieve? And during this time where you're going through those challenges, was that dream kind of going away and it wasn't going towards that direction?
Yeah, I like that question because, I don't know, I don't remember hanging on to any goals when I was going through that drinking and drugging portion of my life. I didn't come from a college educated family, so that wasn't an expectation. I think it was like, oh, hopefully that can happen for one of you kids or any of you kids, whatever. But it wasn't an expectation like, oh, you're going to go to college and you're going to get a business degree or you're going to be in marketing or you're going to be a veterinarian or whatever. So at that point in my life, the reason I actually, before I went into treatment, I loved basketball and I played basketball and played in high school. And then I was actually sent a letter by the University of Wisconsin Stout to play basketball for them. And I didn't pay any attention to it. I didn't care. I was too mired in my dysfunction and the partying and all that sort of stuff. So I didn't answer the letter. And then when I went through treatment, I thought, you know what? I'd really like to see if I can play basketball, see if I can do that in college. And that was really the only thing that I wanted. And when I got out of treatment, I also thought, I want to be in a position where I'm not struggling financially and I'm not hurting from that perspective. I want to go make some money and I want to figure out how to do that. I had no idea how that could possibly be done. So anyway, I ended up going to college and it wasn't the one that originally sent me the letter. It was another school in Michigan. So I went to play there. And then as I'm, getting out of college and I had a graduated with a criminal justice degree because and the reason I did that is because I didn't know anything about business. I didn't know anything about marketing. I didn't understand it. It wasn't where I was from. My dad was a mechanic, like I said. My brother was a police officer. My grandfather on the one side was a police officer. My grandfather on the other side was a firefighter. So that just made sense to me. But I didn't want to necessarily be a cop. And I thought, well, do I want to be an attorney? And then I thought, no, I don't want to go to any more school. And anyway, so there weren't dreams, but once I got out of when I was using, but then when I got out of treatment, I really wanted to do stuff and I wanted to accomplish things and I wanted to be more than I thought was possible for me. And that's where it started for me.
Do you feel like coming out of treatment, you wanted to make up for the time that you were in there? When you talked
For
about
sure.
doing all the stuff that you wanted to do, treatment basically kind of took you away from those things.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, when I think when I was younger, I got decent grades, when I was younger, and I was interested in things and all that sort of stuff. So there was that period, which wasn't a long period for me, and I mean, it was probably 6 years, that everything was set aside, for the most part, except for the drugs and the drinking and the partying and whatever, and that just went downhill real fast. So you know there's definitely a makeup aspect to it. And it's funny because, 19, 20 years old, you think, oh, I wasted so much time,
Yeah.
but you're still 19 or 20 years old. And, there's an entire life ahead, which is the cool part. But that's not how it feels at that time. It feels like, oh, I wasted so much time and I have to crank it up here.
What did you feel was next for you going after treatment? What was the direction that you wanted? Were you also trying to build back friendships, family relationships? What was that direction for you?
Yeah, there's a saying in recovery circles, if you change the game, you got to change the players. So I had to let go a lot, and I would say most, if not all, of those friends. And that was a fairly abrupt, like, cut it off kind of thing, because you can't do the same behaviors and just not drink or just not do drugs. Like, the whole thing's got to change. So and my behaviors have to change outside of the drinking and the drugs. So that was pretty abrupt. As far as family goes, yeah, I definitely put my mom and dad through a lot. I would say my mom much more so. So yeah, I wanted to heal that relationship. I wanted to be trusted again, and I wanted to be trustworthy again. So, and those are really different or difficult things to sort of claw into, when you've lost that trust, and that's a difficult road. So there was definitely a lot of that for me, and in addition to, I started to develop friendships with people who were sober, and had been in recovery or were just starting in recovery, that sort of thing. So that was also helpful to just lighten the blow a little bit of having to let go of that group of friends that I had hung out with for a long time.
Was there ever concern about relapse, or did you try to stick with where you were going in life and try to avoid those situations?
I tried to avoid as well as I could, and I knew it was from people that I got involved in 12-step programs, and so I heard a lot of people that would go out and do the same sort of things, behaviors, or hang out with the same friends, and they would have problems and they would relapse. And even people who 5, 10 years sober, I had a lot of friends who went back out and relapsed. And I feel like my commitment to changing my life was really solid, and I was very miserable, before I went into treatment. And to the point, New Year's Eve of 1984 going into 1985, I was not sure that I wanted to be around anymore. So, like, on this planet. So it hit me pretty hard, and so sobriety hit me hard. I wanted it, and I wanted to do it, and I knew I didn't know anything. I knew I didn't know anything about living a way of life that made more sense than where I was or where I had been. So I was willing to listen, and I was willing to do what people who were experiencing success in recovery told me to do.
How is your journey, if you're looking at the last 5 years? How has that been from a sobriety standpoint or a mental health standpoint when it comes from looking at where you were to now?
Oh, it's yeah, life is grand. I in the beginning of my recovery, I wanted to achieve, I wanted to do things, I wanted to be successful. I didn't know how to do it. I tried a bunch of different things. I left town, Michigan to go to Boston to, for a sales job. I mean, I did a whole bunch of stuff and I finally found, a way to, to be financially successful and that sort of thing. So, but then as time went on and I'm working on myself and I'm working on my financial future and I'm working on, just my life and trying to work on the in here stuff just as much as I work on the out here stuff, which I think is absolutely crucial to get that right and or at least put forth those efforts. And so after a while, you start making money but it's tough. I mean, it's stressful. There's a lot to do. It's never ending. It's relentless. It's, all of those things. And so there's this tug in me of at that time of, you know, I want to be more worried about having a contented and fulfilled life than I do about being a gazillionaire. Like I want to fulfill what's in here. So what became important to me and how I've determined success now, and getting back to your question, how I've determined success now for a few decades is waking up in the morning with a smile on my face. And and how do I do that? It has to do with how I treat my body. It has to do with how I treat my mind, my heart, my soul, and financially. I mean, if I'm worried about how I'm going to put food on the table, I'm not going to wake up in the morning with a smile on my face. So I have to work on all of those things in conjunction with each other. And sometimes I got to put more effort into, how I'm treating my body because, I'm slacking, I'm working too hard and I'm eating stuff that's not right for me. Sometimes I got to work on, the financial part. So the last 5 years for me, I mean, the last long time for me, not even a whisper of being close to what it was way back then. Completely different.
As we've been on the personal journey, switching to the professional journey, one of the titles I mentioned was being an author. Talk about that journey, getting into being an author. When did you know you wanted to do that and write?
It started about 20 years ago. My my wife and when we first met, I would impart stories of my undertakings as a younger person, and my wife would look at me and say, "That's not you. I don't see that. I don't get it. You're not that person." And I would say, "No, I'm not." And I'd said to her, back then, I said, "Remind me to write a book someday." And and so that sort of, kind of perpetuated itself as far as that idea over the next literally probably 19 years. And and so in that time, I probably wrote a page, or a few paragraphs. I would sit down at the computer, I'd bang out a couple things, maybe put down some ideas. I was like, whatever. And then I'd put it down for a period of time. And then January, February of 2023, I said, you know what? And we had moved from Cape Cod down to Georgia. And so we had owned some businesses and properties and that sort of thing. And we just kind of said, okay, this was after COVID, like, okay, we're all set. We're changing things. And so that change led to, you know what, I'm going to write my book and I'm going to put the effort and the time and everything that it takes into it to get a book into the world. And so January, February 23, within 2 to 3 months, I had the first book written, and within 5 months, I had two books written. And I can be a bit of an extremist, but that's kind of how it worked. It was a really beautiful process for me, when I sat down and decided that I was just going to do it, and wonderfully healing, wonderfully therapeutic, and it just kind of opened up this channel of things that came out. So it was great.
Do you feel writing is a lot easier when it's about nonfiction stuff, when it's about your journey and things like that? Or what is your books about that really kind of hit with the readers?
I do feel like for me, because there's a friend of mine who wrote a book, and it's a fiction book, and I told her I would read it, and it has to do with sobriety, it has to do with recovery, it has to do with drinking drugs, all that sort of stuff. And I'm reading it, and I'm like, wow, this is really intense and fascinating and cool, and just pretty amazing in terms of me reading it. But then I thought, I could never write that. It's not, for me, that's not something that would just come out of me. I can't see that being something I would write about. So for me, nonfiction is the way to go, and something where, because I was helped so much by mentors and by people who were just further along than me when I was 19 and treatment and coming out and trying to figure out life. I owe a debt, and I really feel that, and I believe it, and I want to help people, and not just with addiction and recovery and that sort of thing, but with life. There's a lot of people out there who struggle, and it doesn't have to do with addiction. It doesn't have to do with those kinds of things. It may have to do with other things, and so the reason I write is because I want to help, and I'm not one of the, I'm not the point the finger and say, hey, here's all the stuff you need to do to have a great life. How I wrote was, I wrote my story, and I wrote, as honestly as I possibly could about, here's what went on with me. Here's some of the solutions I found. Here's the troubles I got into. Here's the lessons I learned, that kind of thing. And so that people can relate to the material, not say, well, you need to do this 4 times a day and this 3 times a week, and, et cetera, et cetera. It's more about my experience, than anything. And to me, that's when it comes from that well, that's when it comes from the heart, and allows me to connect with people and allows them to connect with me.
I feel like when you're writing something that you can connect with, it's a lot easier because you can be more authentic. And I think people, when they read those words, they can feel the authenticity and this realness when it comes from it. Where fiction, when you're talking about a topic that you can't relate to, that's you can kind of notice that when people are reading. And I think I connect more with nonfiction books like biographies and stuff because you know that that person's went through all that stuff. And especially when, even when interviews I do, when that person has gone through those struggles, you can tell when you can feel the emotions when it comes to it. With writing, do you see yourself writing more books? Do you have that in the pipeline that you're ready to showcase more?
I do. I've got, so here's book one, and book two is coming out in the end of July in 2024. So it's funny because, when we started this journey, and my wife and I would kind of joke about it, and I'm thinking, like, am I really writing a book? Is this actually happening? And is it something that's going to get published and have a cover and people can read, and all that stuff? And yeah, apparently, that can happen. But then but then we started talking about, just there's so much in there that I want to get out and I want to share and I want to, move out into the world. And so that's how book two came about, because I just kept writing. And so when I committed to one, here's how I like to say it. When I committed to one, I committed to three. And so there will be three books in this original sort of, series. And then we'll see what happens after that. But it's an undertaking. It's definitely an undertaking, because I didn't have a clue how to do it. And I'm learning as I go, which I enjoy immensely. But it's an undertaking to get a book from my head down on paper, and then cover and formatting and editing and all that great stuff. It's quite a journey. So three's the number for now.
During this time, did you find other avenues, other areas that you wanted to partake in? Like we talked about entrepreneurial. Did you find a new kind of business outside of writing that you wanted to do?
Not really. Actually, I'm surprised. I've been surprisingly, for me, taken by the writing bug. And so that's branched into doing things on Twitter and doing some other social media stuff, which has been fun. And I keep up writing a blog, and I'm starting to do my own podcast, which should be coming out mid-May, late May, that kind of thing. So it keeps me so busy. I don't have time to do anything else. I do a couple of consulting gigs, sort of from my past life stuff, and and they pay me for that stuff, and they pay me well, and I just keeping up with that, and then keeping up with everything that is sort of the tentacles of writing and where those go. I don't think there's anything else I can do.
With going through addiction and recovery, what is the biggest thing it taught you about yourself? When someone that's listening that maybe is going through a challenge or an addiction, or they're going through the process of recovery, what has it taught you about yourself?
So, the biggest thing probably is that what my problem was not the drinking and the drugs, and that took me a long time for me to get my head around. My problem was sort of my internals, and how I related to the world, and how Daryl related to Daryl. So one of my great mentors said to me, and this is why my book is titled the way it is. He said, as I was, wrestling with some issue or problem or whatever it was back at that time, and at that time I was probably 19 years old, and growing up with the suck it up, walk it off, no pain, no gain, you're not really hurt if you're not bleeding out kind of thing. That was how I grew up. And so my sponsor or mentor said to me, he said, Daryl, when you stop fighting, the fighting stops. And that's why I named my book When I Stop Fighting, because my fight is me. My fight is not the world. It's nothing outside of myself. My fight is me. And that's what I have to figure out. And that's what I try to tell people that are, wanting to get sober or early in recovery. The thing we have to figure out is this. It's not trying to get the world to be what we need it to be, or our friends to be what we need them to be, or our families to be what we need them to be for us to be happy. That has nothing to do with it, because that's constantly going to end in some sort of issue or problem or disappointment. So I have to learn how to deal with me, and I have to be humble enough to be teachable. And if somebody's not sick and tired of being sick and tired, they're not going to be teachable. And that's kind of the place that a person has to come to say, you know what, I am willing to do the work on me to make my life different.
What is something that maybe people don't know you like? This is something kind of fun that our listeners like to learn more about the guests. What is something that maybe you enjoy doing, but a lot of people don't know that you do?
Well, the obvious one for me that people didn't know, and I have to think about this a little bit, but the obvious one is writing books for sure. But I guess I would go with the entire lifestyle um, around writing and around books and around podcasts and around meeting people and around, like, most people would, I think, and I can be, uh, I'm more of an introvert than anything. And some people would say, oh, I don't believe that. But most of the people that have known me in my life that know me would say, yeah, he's an introverted dude. And so they would never see me being on podcasts or, starting my own podcast or anything like that. And that's actually, I like to surprise myself, in terms of trying new things. But I would say that's probably the one that sticks out for me the most right now because it's so fresh and it's so new and it's so, like, what's Daryl doing? That's a good one for me right now.
Usually with podcasts, it's like always sometimes you start revealing things like, oh, I didn't know I was going to talk about that. And then you say, and you're like, okay, I'm glad I said that. Because I always think my family, they're like, every time they hear an episode, and it's usually never about me, it's always we're talking about the guests. And then I reveal something, they're like, I didn't know that about you. And I'm like,
Oh, wow.
well, I always say, you never know what might people learn about me in every episode, even though it has nothing to do with me in those episodes.
Yeah, that's cool though. There's such a fluid nature to most of these conversations, and things just keep popping up, right? Things keep popping in my head, and things, I'm sure they are for you, and you say something, it reminds me of something. And that flow and that fluidity, I think, is just a really cool thing about podcasting that I had no idea existed until I started doing it. So yeah, it's really cool.
The final question I'll ask you for someone that's listening to this interview based on your journey and experience, what tips or advice would you give them to overcome obstacles, accomplish their goals, and rise to the challenge?
There's a lot of things that I've had to do over the years to have, success in my life. And when I say success, and it's really synonymous with rising to the challenge, because that's what we have to do, right? I mean, that is success. There's a big one for me that I think not too many people necessarily think about, but I would like people to think about it this way because this is how it's worked out in my life. Everybody defines success in one way and they define failure, in the opposite way, really, and I have found that failure, and I won't call it failure because failure sounds very final. Some of the things we stumble on, some of the things, times we want to quit, some of the times we want to stop, some of the times we want to just not do it anymore because it's too hard. Those are just as much a part of success as, oh, I won, or I did that, or oh, I achieved that. The stumbling blocks and the difficulties are just as integral, if not more so, to success than the good times. And I think that's really important for people to keep in mind and to understand. And there's a saying that I've used forever and has worked for me in many situations, especially when things get difficult, is this too shall pass. And the difficult times do pass. And the other side of that coin is the good times pass too. So life is just this journey of, you're up and you're, down and up and down, and you sort of, hopefully the trend is like this. That's really, what we want to accomplish as far as our trajectory goes. So I would say in looking to achieve success and in striving to achieve, whatever your definition is of success, just remember that there's going to be tough times. There's going to be things where you just feel like you can't do anymore. There's going to be times when you feel like you're failing, but they're nothing more than stepping stones as long as you keep going. The only time it becomes failure is when you quit.
Daryl, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about your rise to the challenge. You're inspiring so many people, and we are excited to see what the future looks like for you.
Thank you, Alex. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Tune in next time to hear my next guest talk about their rise to the challenge. Remember to follow, subscribe on all major audio platforms. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to get full length episode video format. What path do you take to accomplish your goals? You decide.